My name is Dr. Ria Poole, and I just wanted to thank Vanessa from Well Image so much for delivering our guided reflection and photography activity. Please do continue to post in the Padlet. It will be open for the duration of the Parliament, so we look forward to seeing your images there. So now I'd like to welcome two people in conversation. So firstly, Gillian Burke, a writer, a biologist, and former presenter on BBC Springwatch, and now host of the very thought-provoking and inspiring podcast If I Ruled the World, which is focused on different aspects of environmental justice, decolonisation, abolition, and systems change. And I'd also like to welcome Dr. Bothwell Kabayira, who's an award-winning doctor with over 5 years working in the NHS, interested in health technology, global health, medical leadership and management. So welcome to you both. Today we're going to talk on the topic of politics and power. And obviously this speaks very much to environmental justice on a number of levels. We'll be speaking for half an hour, and then there will be time for questions from the audience. So please do post your questions in the Q&A. Firstly, I'd like to ask you, Jill, you've got a really interesting journey, coming from Springwatch, moving away from that, and then starting up on your own and developing this podcast, some of the topics which we're going to discuss as the conversation moves forward. But I wanted to start asking you about your journey and what led you to here.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Ria, and thank you to all the organizers of this amazing event. So I was born in Kenya. I lived there until I was 10 years old. And because my mum worked for the UN, we relocated, we moved a lot, pretty much ever since I was 10 years old. And my sort of interest and kind of connection and passion, I don't know really what to call it, but essentially my gateway into wanting to be involved in some way or another with environmental work within the nature sector, particularly around the communicating around it, really began in those very early years. I was very lucky. I was born in the 70s when, we didn't have daytime TV, there was no internet, there was no distractions. And so play was almost always outdoors. And outdoors, for me, was a kind of in-between world. It wasn't, kind of the wilds that people might see on natural history films, but it wasn't urban either. I was just in this sort of in-between world where parts of it were managed, parts of it were farmed, and I mean small scale farms, what we call shambas, and then a lot of it was just sort of wild, kind of in between sort of the human and the natural world, and that was my playground. So it was just a natural progression for me to then want to work in natural history film TV. I did biology as the kind of formal education part, to be able to kind of have all the theologies that allow me to do the job. And I worked behind the camera for a really long time and then made that sort of step to being in front of the camera. That was around 2017, 2016, 17. So I was a very late sort of bloomer when it comes to presenting. And for a time on the watches, I was excited by the prospect that this was one of the few platforms that I knew of that that combined a little bit more of like the human conservation pieces alongside the kind of pure blue chip natural history wildlife stories. And I felt like that was my best chance to start directing my work where I really wanted it to be, which was talking about our stories set within this bigger picture of the natural world. And roll on to sort of 2023, I guess, which was my last Springwatch. By that point, I'd had a really great run. I really enjoyed the work, mostly. And I sort of felt like there were lots of things starting to kind of creep into my consciousness. One, frankly, was just the kind of state of the world sort of post-COVID, increased militarization, what was going on in Gaza. And I really felt like it wasn't enough to just talk about nature. And to be honest, it felt like that pretty much my whole career. But it felt like I'd hit a wall with it. And I needed to step off and flex, if you like, my wings and start trying to join the dots. So hence the podcast. I started a podcast where I thought I'd be able to talk about, what I guess is loosely called system change. And really, once I started the podcast, I realized that system change, I was going to need to really change my own mindset. As I spoke to more and more guests on my podcast, I started to realize, like, before I can really tackle the bigger piece, what are the barriers to positive change? We have all the data, we have all the research, we have all the knowledge about sort of, environmental and social injustice, but what is getting in the way of actually making those positive changes? And so that's sort of where I am today, is someone who sort of sits between the nature sector, which I think is a little bit reticent in stepping into political issues, and someone who's at the moment just busy trying to join those dots and and evolve my own thinking before I can really start to share that. But I guess the journey is shared in my podcast. I share the kind of whole the progression and the transformation, I suppose, that I'm going through.
Yeah. I totally noticed that within the podcast. I mean, it's so unusual to have these conversations all in one place in the environmental sphere as well. I mean, in your podcast, you speak about making ecocide a crime, the unelected billionaires, the big tech, deforestation, as you said, abolishing the military, giving Indigenous people a voice, putting nature on the board, all of these things that, collectively and holistically we need to consider. Which is incredibly valuable. I want to step in. I mean, you mentioned Palestine. You speak about the link between ecocide and genocide. Is that something that you can expand on a little bit?
Well, I mean, yeah, to put it really bluntly, war is the single most destructive thing we do as a species. We don't all engage in war. I should be careful about saying we, but just as a shorthand. And yeah, in fact, the very first episode I put out on the podcast was interviewing Jojo Mehta, who is one of the sort of founders of the Stop Ecocide international movement. It's an amazing conversation, and it's quite old now, but it's still one that people refer to a lot when they get in touch with me about the podcast as one of their favorite episodes. And one of the things that I felt was really important about that episode was understanding how the legal thresholds for ecocide, needs to be set before we can actually use it meaningfully in the real world. But while I was having that conversation, I guess my thoughts were, well, if we ignore the sort of human suffering, like a genocide, any kind of military kinetic war, are we really able to enforce ecocide law if we're ignoring another law? So that's one part of the discussion around that, which we get into on the podcast. But the other side of it was really also just talking about the climate impact of military activity, both peacetime and during wartime activity. And again, so it's interesting. It's almost like a full circle. The conversation with Jojo Mehta was the very first conversation I had on the podcast. And the most recent episode is with Dr. Benjamin Neymark, who is the lead researcher on the climate impacts, not just of the military overall, but specifically of the Gaza bombardment. So the two are inextricably linked. And I think it's one of the sort of progressions I've made in my mind, which is how we need to join those dots, particularly in a world that seems to be revving up for more and more military. Well, let's just say that, beating the drums of war is definitely what seems to be happening more and more. So I think it's a really important thing that the nature sector and environmentalists need to start finding entry points into those conversations, obviously centering human suffering, but also understanding that environmental damage, destruction from just carbon emissions and the impact on climate, to the release of toxins, to the destruction of seed banks, of landscapes. I mean, the list goes on. So yeah, they're definitely two sides of the same ugly coin.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for putting that so well. there is an initiative that you've started, Naturalists for Palestine, calling on the environmental sector to recognise and seek justice for this immense human suffering, not just for the genocide in Gaza, but also considering Sudan, Congo, Ukraine, and others. You know, where do you see this going, and what are your ambitions for that coalition?
Well, yeah, coalition. We're a group of people that basically found each other online out of a shared frustration of watching for 2 years so much destruction and suffering, and wanting to see how, as a sector, we can speak up more, speak out, not just about obviously now Gaza, but other parts of the world where they're suffering, Sudan, Congo, and I at the moment, as far as we've gotten is a website where people can at least be visible, put their names to the website, so we can start to get a measure of how many people in the sector feel the same way, share the same concerns. And then, this is, frankly, too little, too late for too many. But I guess the assertion going forward is that we cannot do this again. We can't sit by and watch this level of suffering, but also, frankly, the dismantling of international law, the rules-based order. Because if we, hope to see environmental progress and a lot of that pushed through regulation and the law, we have to stand firm on upholding the rule of law, no matter where it is and who's breaking it. So I think these things are still, it's still a young group. We're not quite sure how we're going to take it forward, but the very least is about getting names onto them. If people support the statement on the website, to put their names to it, so that we can start to get a measure of how many people in the sector want to see this kind of change.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes back to, if we're not caring for people, how are we caring for the environment when we're all so interconnected? So
Yeah.
yeah. Bothwell, I want to bring you in now. It's not the first time that you've met Gillian. I understand that you've met at a previous conference. So I wonder if, Bothwell, you'd like to yeah, kind of just describe your meeting and kind of what brought you into this space.
Thank you so much for having me. So yeah, I met Gillian at uh, basically it was a conference by the Green Party. Um, they were just I've just been very much just interested in what the Green Party had to say. Um, but I just wanted to tell you a bit about my story, to be honest. Like Gillian, I was born, I'm an African. I was born in Zimbabwe, and I came to the UK when I was quite young, and I grew up in Birmingham. So that was quite a culture shock, and it was just a different world, to be honest. Because back in Africa, it was just a case of, you could be a bit freer as a child, you could just walk, and, the community felt like it protected you. And coming to Birmingham, where I didn't practically, know my neighbors, and I felt quite restricted. And then I just, did my schooling here, A levels, and then I was awarded a scholarship to study medicine in Bulgaria. So for 6 years of my life, I was in Bulgaria, Eastern Europe, and that was also quite different, from the UK. And then when I graduated in 2020, I came back to the UK, and unfortunately, it was the COVID pandemic, and that's when I started, my career in the NHS. And I've worked across the West Midlands, um, uh, Birmingham, Nottingham, and then eventually I ended up here in the Southwest. And yeah, that's a bit about my story.
Thank you. And you're involved in a lot of community projects, is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So ever since started working within, the NHS, I just became a bit more, how do I say, just aware about my roots. So I just always thought of myself, as, just just black, I guess. But then I started just reconnecting with my African heritage and just finding out some of my staff. You know, the NHS is very diverse. And then at one point, I just saw that some of the figures were saying that Zimbabweans were the 10th most common nationality within the NHS. So this just prompted me to just seek out other Zimbabweans and just, see what we can do as a community to help Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwean healthcare system, which is quite weak compared to the NHS. So in 2020, I created Zampa UK, which is a network of healthcare professionals just coming together for one cause to positively impact the community. So we use our skills and resources to kind of give back, as us within the diaspora, to just give back to people back home who need care expertise, in the diaspora. So we currently offer mentoring. So if someone wants to become a doctor, I can I just give them medical mentorship, help them with the personal statements, help them get practice their interviews. And if someone wants to become maybe a physiotherapist, I can link them up with one of the physiotherapists in our network. So it's just kind of community, just empowering each other, and then trying to just uplift one another, and just being visible, being present. And the dream is just to go back and give our skills and expertise to, a developing healthcare system in Africa.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's incredible work, and it's something that we can all be conscious and mindful of doing more of, and seeking those opportunities. But I think it's making links with those over here of the diaspora, where you've got that really unique insight into, well, what's actually going on the ground, and where are people being underserved, and actually what resources and privileges do we have that we can then share and uphold. So yeah, incredibly valuable. So I'm interested in terms of how the two of you kind of came together, because you've obviously come from very different disciplines, and yet you met at this Green Party conference. And so where did you kind of align and connect and go, aha, we're kind of together?
Well, I mean, if I'm honest, the Green Party conference, especially in Cornwall, it was in Chasewater Village. It's a small village hall. So frankly, just by virtue of just being the only two Black people in the room, that brought us together. But when we were invited to speak here, and when I was invited to speak here, and I was thinking about who else to bring on, I really wanted to bring Bothwell on, because I feel like, when we talk about environmental justice and social justice, and we talk about politics and we talk about power, and we try and stir that all into one big pot, I think this perspective that, sort of the diaspora, so those of us who, and I know that this extends beyond just the skin tone and skin color. There are many people, who have that experience of, maybe having a European parent, or, some dual nationality or mixed ethnicity. And when you have your foot sort of, I mean, the way I describe myself, and I'm not sure whether this would, Bothwell will agree with this, but I always feel like, even though I left Kenya when I was 10, and I've lived in Austria since then, and I've now lived in the UK for 30 years. So frankly, I've lived here longer than I have anywhere else. I still feel like I've got one foot in both homes, or 2 feet actually in both homes. And there's something about that connection when you see it with other people, who there's a sense that, you can advance, and you can take, sort of really follow your own path and stay on track with the thing that you've set out to do. So in Bothwell's case, it's, to become a doctor. In my case, it was to work in the natural history film industry. But there's that thing that you can't quite turn your back on what you left behind. And as a result, especially for someone living here, I always feel like there's parts of the story that are missing. And and just to use something like a really bizarre, but hopefully hopefully a useful illustration of what I'm trying to say is, as someone who's really familiar with British culture and really loves lots of things about living here, I find it interesting that the kind of this wave of nationalism that, if you took something as simple as, tea, and that seems like a very British thing. And when you kind of consider how many cups of tea are drunk, like every, I think, minute, I think there's millions of cups of tea drunk every minute. And in fact, I can tell you, 10 million cups of tea are made a day in this country. And there's that sense of it's a very British pursuit, that all the tea is processed and very much branded as a British product. But when you think about where it comes from, like there's hardly any tea grown in this country. So that connection between what feels like a very British thing with environmental and social injustice somewhere far away. So a country like I was lived in Kenya. What you're looking at is the really intricately connected picture of something that feels very British, is very enjoyable, and feels very benign. But when you kind of stretch out to how that's connected with colonial legacy, with the current picture of even just the kind of impacts in terms of the environment of tea growing, even coffee, one of the most sprayed crops on the planet. If people were able to tell those stories, to make those connections, to really understand that what goes on in this country is not disconnected to what happens in other parts of the world. And certainly what goes on in this country is not even disconnected to the kind of marginalized communities here, wherever they be, whatever they look like. And I think that's one of the reasons why I really felt this connection with Bothwell in terms of wanting to try and have this conversation, because that's the way I see it. I use this really, kind of slightly bizarre example of tea, but I was curious as well with, being able to have this conversation with Bothwell as well, in terms of how he sees that connection and whether there's that sense of you're trying to invest your energies and your care and commitment to two places, in a sense. And what does that look like, for the environmental movement? What does that look like for, our sort of healthcare? Of course, the two being, again, inextricably linked. And in a sense, this is why I, ended up doing a podcast called System Change, If I Rule the World, about system change, because it's trying to have these conversations that are sprawling, that meander everywhere, but ultimately thread the needle, join the dots, and kind of hopefully bring us back to a place where, like, oh, wow, we are all connected. It's not just, a lovely idea. It is true, Have I frozen or someone frozen?
No, you're still here.
All right. I was like, stop talking. Yeah. So anyway, that's to answer your question, why the connection between Bothwell and myself.
For sure. Bothwell, would you like to kind of respond?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, in Cornwall, there's not much diversity as compared to Birmingham. So at the moment I saw Gillian, my eyes kind of just lit up. And I must be honest, I didn't know who she was. But we just, I just approached her and I said, "Oh, okay, why, why are you here?" And we just started talking, and the value I was getting, from her, I just didn't know who she was. It's only when I saw her walk to the front and lead the next presentation, I was like, wow, I'm in the presence of greatness here. But no, she said a good point. I mean, we're all connected. That's so true. And now, as an adult, some of the things that we used to do, I just thought of it as in my childhood. Back in Zimbabwe, I came to the UK when I was 8, but my vivid memories was just sitting on a veranda, so just outside in the sunshine, having morning tea with like a sweet potato, and I thought that's just natural. This is what Zimbabweans do. But then this could also be traced, to, I don't know, that British influence when they were here, when it was still called Rhodesia. That tea culture of, for breakfast, afternoon tea, and to this day, the Zimbabweans do, we love tea. We actually grow tea in the Honde Valley of Zimbabwe. So there's a brand called Tanganda Tea. So it's amazing how, we are connected, and I still love tea to this day. I can't, even in the NHS runs on tea, no tea, no work. So it's just quite amazing.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's a really powerful story, isn't it? In terms of our colonial legacy, that's ongoing, and the impact is still ongoing. And I think there's many examples of this as well. I mean, I was thinking to the forest fires that particularly devastated Portugal earlier this year. You've got paper companies planting non-native trees, allegedly starting fires as well, so that they can buy this land cheaply to plant more non-native trees, and then also through the spraying of pesticides. Like, isn't it all connected? We can use so many examples. The olive trees, being burned and displaced as well, and we had the fires in Palestine too. So there's so much, whether it's in our supply chains, whether we're thinking about deforestation. We can look at so many different aspects of environmental justice through the lens of colonization, through globalism, through capitalism, and it is quite overwhelming. One thing that I did want to speak about, particularly, I think Gillian and I were having a chat about this the other day as well, but it's the shorthand when it comes to climate change. It's the shorthand when we're looking at carbon. One of the things that I feel is that it's quite an undefined term. It's not that specific. It's very general. What are we actually looking at? Are we looking at contaminants? Are we looking at pollution on a broader scale? And what's at play? What's at stake? Who are the main actors? How does this kind of fit into the geopolitical context? And also in terms of this constant extractivism through the world's resources, because there's such an interplay here. I feel that just looking at carbon is actually quite reductive, and maybe a slight sort of greenwashing itself or over some of the actual issues that do need to be addressed and head on.
So what's wrong with the world, basically?
Yeah, sorry, yeah. All of that.
So just to, I guess, I mean, there's a lot of discussion around whether measuring a single metric really captures the full extent of, the challenge that we're up against in terms of both environmental and social justice. And, that you can have all sorts of conversations around that. I think one of the things that I've really learned in trying to work with this in conversation with so many people on my podcast is really trying to get back to just basics in terms of definitions, and making sure that we're not using terms that have become a shorthand, an easy kind of reach when you're trying to express something. I was actually listening to someone else's podcast, Nate Hagen's, whose podcast is called The Great Simplification Podcast. I don't know if anyone's come across it. It's really great. And he just sums this up so beautifully. He says that, for example, talking about carbon and the climate crisis, misses the bigger picture, which is that what we're really looking at is a crisis of ecological overshoot, living just way beyond the kind of planetary boundaries. And I know he won't be the first person to have said this, but I think to me that really kind of comes back home. And again, when we want to talk about, the sort of environmental social justice connection, the ecological overshoot isn't happening equally, in all parts of the world. There's an incredible demographic skew in terms of where you are in the world and how far you're overshooting the kind of planetary boundaries. I think where I'm at with it is I know that you do, cautioned against being reductive, but I'm really trying to just almost demystify and push back on a lot of the terminology that is used when we talk about the climate, when we talk about colonial legacy, all those things. Capitalism, for example. Like I've started to look at these things like, well, capitalism is like a business plan. I mean, I know that if you're an economist, you'll probably shoot this down in a second, but just bear with me. I think of capitalism like a business plan that began, with a group of people literally in a room who then needed to project that plan beyond political boundaries. So that was the imperial project. And then the colonial project was, once you project that power outside your boundaries, you then need to essentially enact that plan outside your political boundaries. So that's the colonial piece. And then colonialism, obviously, people didn't like it in these countries, so it needed to rebrand after independence. Eventually, we call it neoliberalism, is essentially what we've got now. And we're now sort of at this kind of end stage, which is a kind of, again, another terminology, imperial boomerang, where all that power that was projected outside of political boundaries, outside of the seat of empire, is now being turned back on itself. And that's why we see this rise of fascism. So again, this is not my kind of, unique and wonderful idea. This is my distillation of lots of conversations I've had on my podcast, listening to other people who've really helped to kind of shape my thinking. I think for me, one of the most important questions to ask is, after everything we know about climate change, about environmental degradation, about social injustice, like why are we still, and the data tells us this, why are we still facing this uphill struggle to turn things around for positive change? And I think for me, it's starting to kind of go, oh, hang on a second, we've just got a really bad 500-year-old business plan that's been carried out through imperialism, colonialism, etc. And we need to tackle that, and and see it for what it is. It's not an intractable law of nature. It's a business plan, and we need to change it.
I think that's so true. I mean, in terms of these outdated business plans, they all seem to be centered around scarcity. And obviously, when you've got a scarcity mindset, you become dependent. It's easy to control people. It's easier to be reductionist and, to go for the low-hanging fruit that doesn't solve the problem. Whereas actually we live on a very beautiful and abundant earth that just needs better care and protection. And so, thinking about it in terms of abundance, but our responsibility and duty of care hopefully can lead to more choice and freedom and discernment in terms of where we go next. I'm conscious of the time and whether you've got something to kind of add before we go to the discussion and chat with Charlie, or if there's anything else that you'd like to close with, Bothwell or Jill. No, shall we go to the chat? Yeah, okay, lovely.
Okay, so we've got a few questions for you both. Thank you very much for this, by the way, fascinating stuff, really enjoyed it. So first question is for Jill. So Jill, what do you think are the prospects for ecocide as a new international crime, being recognized as an international crime?
So if you follow the Stop Ecocide International movement, you'll find their web pages. I know there's going to be resources given out sort of as part of this webinar. But yeah, so if you follow them on their website, their socials, they're constant updates. The team are in that organization are engaged in really sort of, I would say, high level discussions with the kind of legal international law and the infrastructure around the ICC and the ICJ. And even though at the moment, those institutions are really suffering a kind of crisis of credibility, frankly, there is that sense that, this isn't the time to pull back on trying to push forward to have ecocide enshrined as like the fifth statute, the fifth pillar of their own statutes. So I guess, if you're asking me the question rather than of the people who are actually, championing this campaign, I still think that, to pursue ecocide as a law, to have it enshrined as law in the absence of dealing with the fact that these institutions are having this credibility crisis, the fact that there's this culture of impunity that we seem to be living through, for me, really undermines the kind of strength of the law. That they're just words on a page. If we don't get behind, supporting international law and rules-based order. So that's what I would say to that.
Sorry, I should have kept unmuted. Thank you very much, Jill.
Okay.
Question for Bothwell. So would you say nature prescribing is part of your work?
Personally, no, I'm not. It's not part of my specific role as just senior house officer within the hospital setting. But I am aware of a GP practice in Devon. She's a GP that regularly encourages her patients is it nature therapy or garden therapy. It's just as a means to tackle depression, loneliness. Yeah, so I am aware about that model, just being outdoors, being active, as opposed to the medical method that is typically prescribed to treat these conditions with medication. So it's not regularly part of my role, but I am aware about it and other just nature therapy, exercise therapy. And also social prescribing as well. But yeah, I'll try and find out the contact details and pass them to the organizers.
Yes, and you've got a question in the chat actually asking you which surgery in Devon that is. So if you can let them know.
Yeah, no, it's quite new. But yeah, I'll do my best to find out.
Thank you very much. Now, a question for you both. Both of you have lived and worked internationally, and you describe your commitments through a global lens. Do you think it's possible to challenge environmental injustice without taking a global perspective? And what does this perspective mean for those working in the international sector in the UK? Bothwell, feel free to start, maybe, if you want. I mean, you don't have to, but if you want to start, feel free to.
So I'm just reading the question again.
Jill, did you want to come in first then?
Yeah, so once I find the unmute button. I mean, obviously, for me, that the answer is real easy. I don't think you can separate out the global picture from the local picture. It is, we live in a really deeply interconnected world. We always have. This is like one of the really interesting things that in the sort of current climate, cultural climate, for want of a better expression, that we seem to be going through. I feel that there's a narrative which is that this kind of globalization and interconnectedness is sort of like a new phenomenon. It's a failed experiment. But I mean, people have always moved. Species move. Nothing is static. Like I just to have a little sort of nature moment. One of the things that I quite often will do if I'm out, for a walk. I live in Cornwall on the south coast, so I've got very easy access to the coast path, and I'm very privileged and lucky for that. But there's a little spot that I go and sit on, and I sit on that peninsula, and I look out, and for a brief moment, I'm aware that literally nothing stays still. The air, the water, the breeze, everything around me, I start to like really expand that out to the whole planet is spinning on its axis. We're moving through space. So this idea that somehow these like lines on a map, imaginary lines on a map, are going to contain all of that is actually quite laughable. So we absolutely have to connect the dots. And I know it makes it difficult in terms of your messaging, if you're applying for grants, if you're trying to just get a simple survey out to people. It's a challenge. It definitely is, which is why, I end up talking for so long. But I do think, we really do need to push back on this idea that if we kind of, pull up the drawbridge and just take care of our own little patch, that, everything else, well, that will be okay. I just don't think that works.
Yeah, thank you very much for this. Bothwell, did you want to come in?
Just to echo in what Gillian said, I don't think we live in a global village. I mean, it's I don't think it's about, it's possible to just proceed without taking that perspective. Just the hospitals here, the 60% of the NHS, it's made up from people from different nationalities or from different countries. So it's I'm just trying to express that despite where you are, you might encounter someone from a different part of the world. So I think that needs to it's kind of hard for you to proceed without taking that global perspective. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and that notion of interdependence, or I would call it radical interdependence, is really quite key in my view as well. And I think the way it's been spoken about today is really bringing it into sharp relief, especially the tea example that was given earlier. What's in a cup of tea? Well, you have some tea leaves for sure, dried up tea leaves, but you have a history, and you have a history, you have people, and you have structures of power. Not that I want to ruin everyone's cup of tea, of course, but at the same time, what Jill, you allowed us to do is to visualize, in some ways, colonialism, right? And I think being able to visualize very much the structures of oppression, of power and oppression, is a task in itself, because before we can actually think of system change, before we can actually go and, try and address social injustice and environmental injustice, we've got to be able to see them. And I think there's a bit of an issue these days that, we're not being able to see those injustices and to see the interconnectedness as well. What's fascinating is that tea is not a really British thing that much, really. I mean, and yet it's the most British thing ever, right? Okay, so that the most British habit is actually super global. And that, it's the same for curry. I mean, curry is super popular in England, in the UK, and yet it really depends on, other cultures. I mean, there's, and the same for the NHS. But we keep thinking that we're at the center here, the global north, and that the rest is on the margins. But no, everything is intermeshed. But that intermeshing is so hard to visualize a lot of the time because we're bombarded with ways of thinking, with worldviews that prevent us, that hide it, that conceal very much those interconnections. Sorry, rant over, but I just felt really quite excited.
Oh, I love a rant. And just very briefly, I know we're almost at time, but I just want to add, like, even bringing it back to a more UK picture, just in case we feel that there's a need for that. I mean, sugar is the connectedness between sugar, pesticides, particularly neonicotinoids, the healthcare system, the agricultural system, the fact that we've got parts of the country that are given over to farming sugar beet that needs to then be sprayed with neonicotinoids to then produce a product that nobody really needs, that is causing all kinds of like metabolic, disease downstream, therefore a burden on the NHS. I mean, that's a perfect example of that sort of interconnectedness. And ultimately, we're looking at a product that has deep, deep roots in slavery and colonialism as well. So, if there was ever a product, sugar, the most benign thing that probably everyone has in their kitchen, tells all those stories.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Ria, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I think we're at time. There's a question for you in the chat, Jill, asking whether you've had any pushback from your advocacy work in terms of TV and media. If you wanted to briefly speak to that, and then I shall offer a close.
The answer is probably yes, but I haven't really paid attention to it. I think I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. And I think that's also a good lesson for all of us on this journey. If we constantly, look to see what eyes are on us, we can end up censoring ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. And that is the last thing that we need to do. We're all vulnerable in the space when we have to stick our heads above the parapet, and yet it's so worth doing. So I want to thank you both for a really engaging and thought-provoking discussion. Bothwell, thank you so much. Gillian, thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
You're so welcome. And I recommend everybody to check out Gillian's podcast, If I Ruled the World, on Spotify and other platforms.